Welcome everybody to the RMS wishlist. So if you've been watching my videos up to this point, you'll have a fairly good idea of what I show on this channel. I show a lot about what the RMS engine is capable of and what we can do with respect to map making. But there's a lot of situations in which I think of things that would be nice for the RMS engine to be capable of that aren't necessarily true at the moment. So I'm putting this video together to kind of gather thoughts together, and I thought that might be interesting for other people to see. So I'm going to approach this in terms of categories. So the first category we're going to be talking about is map making features. Whether this category ends up being broken up into multiple videos, we'll have to see in a bit. But the next category, after we're done with this, is going to be effects. And if anyone wants to provide any insights or comments or feedback, feel free to do so in the comment section, or better yet, you can head over to the RMS Discord channel, which I tend to link in the descriptions of my videos, and you can further the discussion over there. So for the first item, I have put together this demonstration of a map. So I have player lands connected to a neutral land, and we have grass surrounding. So if I had the idea where I wanted to elevate this grass while leaving this dirt at the elevation it's currently at, we're not really capable of doing that in a random map script. If we try to do something like this, we create elevation 3 only on the grass. Let's generate the map. And we can see that the dirt that comprises the player lands is unaffected by this elevation. The dirt which comprises the middle land is unaffected by the elevation. But since these paths between the players and the dirt are made up of connections, it's not possible to control whether the elevation will avoid this path also, because the connections come after the elevation section. Similarly, if I wanted to put a terrain mask on this dirt terrain, I could try to do that in the terrain section. So I mask grass on top of dirt 2 with a terrain mask value of 1. And what we can see here is that it masks the player lands, masks the neutral land, but again, the path between the player lands and the neutral land will still be unaffected by this terrain mask, because the terrain section has already taken place before this connection is even drawn. So what I think would be a nice feature to have is a secondary terrain section and a secondary elevation section that come after connections. So the current elevation generation and terrain generation sections can basically stay where they are, but if there were new sections entirely called elevation secondary and terrain secondary, then these would behave fairly the same way as they do, except they would come after the connections have been drawn, so we could potentially differentiate between connected lands in order to figure out where elevation is, and we could put terrain masks on connections also, which would be useful. So for the next item, we should know by now that when we are generating lands in the land generation section, a land with 0 land percent or 0 tiles will always be represented by its base size, and the base size is always a square. And in many cases, it could be useful to have a circular base, but it's pretty much impossible to have a land that is perfectly circular. We can try and approximate a circular land by adjusting land percent number of tiles with a clumping factor. I like to use 20. And that can get us fairly close, but it's not exact. So one thing that would be useful to have is just a parameter that if we were to set the land percent back to 0, and if an attribute existed such as set circular base. And what that would do is it would just create the base as a circle with the same basic radius. It would look a bit like this, only better. So the next idea on the list is independent circle radii. So if we take a look at the way our player lands are set up right now, we have a circle radius of 35, and we can change that if we want to space the players out a bit further away from the center of the map, so they're now closer to the edge. And if we were to copy this player land statement, we can see it created a secondary set of player lands on the same circle radius. But if we were to take the secondary set, and if we wanted to reduce the circle radius to have this particular set of player lands spawn closer to the center, what that does is it overrides the circle radius of the first set of player lands, because currently it's not possible to have lands on a different circle radius. So that's one thing that could be helpful. And expanding on that, circle radius may not even have to be an attribute that's limited only to player lands. So let me just get rid of this. So I'll say land % 0 and base size 11. So right now, if I just have a generic create land statement, this neutral land can spawn with quite a lot of freedom. But if we were to allow circle radius to apply to neutral lands as well, if we were to draw like an imaginary circle here, 25% of the map's length away from the center, it could still spawn randomly as long as it adheres to that circle. That could also be potentially interesting. And then furthermore, regarding the idea of controlling the position of neutral lands on a map, we can see by this demonstration here that if we were to just take a couple of generic create land statements, repeat them several times, we can kind of see where they're able to spawn on the map. We can notice that they will always tend to avoid the corners within the borders they are specified in. So sometimes this may not be very desirable. It may be desirable to allow lands to spawn in the corners, so a simple attribute like allow in corners could potentially also be very useful. Okay, so next on the list is more precise control for zone avoidance. So in this demonstration, I have player lands. The zone is set by team, and the other zone avoidance is specified that separates teams by the water. So the other zone avoidance distance in this case is 15. You can see that this team zone and this team zone are 15 tiles apart. And if I wanted to put a neutral land right in the middle here, I could do something like this. Notice that this neutral land has no other zone avoidance distance. So if we were to take that literally and say that this neutral land doesn't have to avoid the player lands, you'd expect it to just be able to generate right in the middle, which kind of bridges the two lands together. And when we do that, what we can see is that the other zone avoidance distance of the player lands is, in some cases, affecting the player distance from the neutral land. We can see over here that this player land and this player land seem to be forced back in order to avoid this neutral land here. This land doesn't seem to be affected by this because it's able to touch. So there doesn't really seem to be any logic in this, and potentially some attributes that could be added to make things a bit more intuitive without breaking existing maps could potentially include, for example, ignore zone avoidance. So even though the player lands have another zone avoidance distance, if we create the neutral land, it will basically ignore that. I can also think of something like avoid player zone by X amount of tiles. Or if we were in a situation where we had zones specified independently, so if the zone was specified based on its ID, we can have like a generic avoid zone, and this would have 2 arguments. So this particular land would avoid the particular zone ID, zone 1, and then the second argument would be how many tiles to avoid that particular zone. Alright, so these next few items are focused on elevation. So currently in RMS, there are 2 ways to create hills on a map. So the first is a generic create elevation statement. So I say create elevation 3 on top of dirt, and it creates elevation 3 on top of dirt. And then the other way, let's comment this out, is applying a base elevation in the land generation section. So if I say base elevation 3, that also creates a hill on the dirt. So these 2 methods have different aspects of them that are true for one and are not necessarily true for the other. So the first thing is that when you apply a base elevation to the land, you can go pretty much as high as you want. So I have specified the elevation at 3. If I want to go all the way up to 13, nothing stops me from doing that. That's a rather large hill. And if I were to switch it back to a create elevation command, I try to create elevation 13, we can notice that the hill is considerably smaller, because when you use a create elevation command, the cap is at 7. So if I were to switch this from 13 to 7, there should be no difference. Yeah, so it would be nice is if create elevation could go higher than 7, since base elevation on lands can already go above 7. Additionally, you can apply a gradual elevation to a create elevation command. So if I were to put the attribute spacing, now we can see that instead of going straight up, the elevation is in steps. So 3 tiles between each step of elevation. And if we try to apply that to base elevation, spacing 3, that doesn't really do anything, because that elevation spacing attribute is only an attribute of create elevation and not create land. So it would also be nice is if this elevation spacing could be an attribute for lands with a base elevation applied to them also. And then next, what I'll do, let's remove these. Instead of creating the elevation on dirt, we'll create the elevation on grass. And see, when we create the elevation on grass, we can see that it pretty much elevates all of the grass on the map except the area around the player base. So elevations created with this create elevation command are hard-coded to avoid player lands by X amount of tiles. We cannot change that, and we cannot change the distance. So what would be useful for this situation is there's an attribute for terrains that says set avoid player start areas. And if we were to apply an argument to that, say 20 tiles, we could control how close the elevation is able to spawn from the player lands. And it doesn't necessarily have to be limited to player lands either. If there was also an attribute saying set avoid land ID, then potentially we could get elevations to avoid spawning too close to neutral lands as well. Okay, so the next thing is technically elevation related, but it's actually happening in the terrain generation section. There's a create terrain desert, base terrain grass, 100% of the land. We can see that we've covered up all the land. Now if I were to put the attribute set flat terrain only, based on what it says, we would expect it to only generate on this flat terrain and not on the slopes. So we generate that and we see that absolutely nothing changes. And that's because set flat terrain only works if it is paired with spacing to other terrain types, and the value of this must be at least 1. So it's only in this way where we can get terrain to avoid spawning near the slopes of lands. But if we take a closer look, and it'll be easier if we turn on the grid, is that when we do this, we're always going to be limited in the sense that we cannot specify flat terrain within 1 tile of the slope. So we would prefer the flat terrain to end on this tile rather than this tile, but right now that's not what's happening. So what would be nice is if set flat terrain only was capable of working on its own without needing this spacing to other terrain types, because then intuitively that would mean we could get right up to the slope. And similarly, it could also potentially be useful to have a set slope terrain only attribute for terrains. So instead of only generating on the flat terrains, it only generates on the slopes. So continuing on with terrains, let's take this map as an example. So I have this lake in the middle, and the player lands are this dirt, with the base terrain of the map being grass. So if I said I wanted to create a forest on the border of the map, what I would like to have happen is I would like to create forest terrain on top of this grass, and I want it to avoid the water by a certain amount of tiles. So if I were to try something like that, I say generate forest on top of grass, and to get it to avoid the water, I say spacing to other terrain types is 35. The problem with that is spacing to other terrain types means spacing to all terrain types, which means if it has to avoid the water by 35 tiles, it also has to avoid these dirt lands by 35 tiles also, which leaves very little room to put the forest. So for terrains, what would be a nice attribute to have is the ability to avoid specific terrains instead of just generically all terrains. So it would go something like this: avoid terrain water as the first argument, and then the spacing as the second argument. And the result of that would end up looking something like this. So the forest that we would create would avoid only the water by 35 tiles, and the rest of the terrains that are bordering it will not be avoided because only the water is supposed to be avoided in this case. Okay, so the last section in this video is going to be regarding connections. So in this sample map, we have a couple of lands. These green ones are representing player lands, and these dirt lands are representing neutral lands. So if I were to bring a generic connection statement in here that says create connect all player lands, replacing water with shallow. When we do this, we can see that each player land will connect to every other player land, sometimes cutting across the middle. Now, in some cases, it may be desirable to only connect adjacent players. For example, connect this one to this one, this one to this one, and so on. Now, an idea could potentially be to have a command in here called create connect adjacent players, but this would only really work in random placement maps, because if we were doing a direct placement setup, players could be all over the place and there wouldn't really be any adjacent players. So one thing that could be potentially useful is an attribute in connections called min connection distance and max connection distance. So if we take a look at the map, we have lands which are a certain distance apart from each other. So if we say that the distance between this land and this land is, say, 30 tiles, we could specify that the max connection distance would be 30, which means anything greater than 30. So if it was to attempt to draw a connection between this land and this land, which is greater than that 30 tiles, it wouldn't attempt to make that connection because it would exceed that max connection distance. So that the only connections that could be made are the ones between the adjacent lands, because these would be the only ones that could fit within that max connection distance. So also regarding connections, connections always include a reference to the player lands. So let's say I wanted to connect all of these outside lands to each other, but not necessarily connect them to the middle. So if I were to change this from, say, connect all players land to just a generic create connect all lands, see, this would include a connection from each land to each of the other lands, including players. Now, there is technically a way to prevent a connection to the player lands, but it necessitates that the player lands would have to be a different terrain type. If I were to say terrain cost of grass is 0, now it won't attempt to draw connections to the player lands, although some of the connections from these neutral lands to one another may still pass through the player lands because that happened to be the shortest route. But depending on the map, it's not always feasible for the player lands to have a different terrain type than the lands you want to be connecting. So just generally speaking, it would be nice to have a bit more control over which lands could be connected to each other. So one of the potential options is a command that technically already exists in the game, and it's called create connect same land zones. I'll just get rid of that terrain cost. But this really doesn't do anything different compared to create connect all lands. If we take a look, we can see that the player lands are still being included in these connections, despite the fact that they should all have a separate zone because we left the zone unspecified when we created the player lands. Let me just undo this quickly just to make sure it's exactly the same. And yes, it is. So if create connect same land zones worked the way it is spelled out, then this could technically work in the sense that if each of these neutral lands have the same zone ID, and each player land technically has a different zone ID because we left the zone unspecified, that could also potentially work in excluding the player lands from these connections without necessarily having to rely on a different terrain type. And it could also be potentially useful to connect lands independently based on either zone or land ID. So if we notice up here, each of these neutral lands has a different land ID. So if I just wanted to create one connection between land ID 1 and land ID 2, I could think of something like create connect land IDs. And then in the attributes, I could say include land ID 1 and include land ID 2. So based on this, it should only attempt to create a connection between land ID 1 and land ID 2 because those are the only lands that we included. And we could potentially include other lands as well. It doesn't have to be just limited to 2. So those were just some of my ideas of things regarding map creation that would be nice for RMS to be capable of. And like I said at the beginning, feel free to discuss either my ideas or some ideas of your own. If we get a bunch of other good ideas, I'll probably produce a follow-up video. But I think that's going to be it for this one. So thanks everybody for watching.